My name is Nate Garland, and for 14 months, I was the law enforcement officer assigned to Canvas, Alaska, a place where the gravel road ends and the void begins. I moved there to escape a shattered marriage and a mountain of debt, thinking the silence of the tundra would heal me. But in the Arctic, the silence isn't empty. It's heavy, and the darkness doesn't just obscure your vision. It starts to populate the gaps in your mind. My first hint that Canvas wasn't a normal town came when Carl appeared. He stood 15 feet from the general store in 30 below weather wearing nothing but a light canvas jacket. His skin a wind-burned red, yet he wasn't shivering. When I asked where he came from, he simply pointed north, toward the frozen, infinite ocean where nothing human can survive. His boots were bone-dry, as if he had stepped out of a dream rather than a snowstorm. When he vanished from a locked clinic room the next morning, leaving no footprints in the fresh snow outside, the town elders didn't look for him. They just whispered that he wasn't there for me. That was the first crack in my reality, the first sign that the rules of biology and physics didn't apply once the polar night took hold of the coast. By December, the sun was a memory, replaced by 22 hours of total, suffocating blackness. It was during a coastal patrol that I first heard it. A low, organic thrumming vibrating through the sea ice. It wasn't the mechanical groan of shifting plates. It was a rhythmic, resonant pulse, like the heartbeat of a god buried miles beneath the permafrost. Every 4 seconds, it hit my ribcage, a physical pressure that made my teeth ache and my instincts scream to run. I stood on that ice shelf, 3 miles from any living soul, feeling the earth breathe beneath my boots. When I finally asked Pete, a local fisherman, he didn't laugh. He told me that the years the ice speaks are the years people go missing. He told me about the officer before me, Walt, who fled after 3 villagers walked straight into the ocean. One man was found 12 miles out on foot, a distance impossible to cover in the time he'd been gone. His tracks a perfect, straight line leading toward the North Pole. Another woman, a 60-year veteran of the ice, left her parka neatly folded on a beach post before walking into a 40 below gale in her shirt sleeves. They weren't lost. They were summoned. The silence following Howard Fell's disappearance was louder than the wind. I sat in his frozen cabin, staring at that puck of ice in his coffee mug, and realized the heartbeat wasn't just a sound. It was a countdown. I keyed my radio, hoping for the comforting crackle of the dispatch in Anchorage, but all I got was a rhythmic static. Thump shhh, thump shhh. It matched the pulse of the ice perfectly. I scrambled out of the cabin, my breath hitching in the -40-degree air, and nearly collided with a figure standing by my snowmobile. It was Ruth, the elder. She wasn't wearing a coat. She stood there in a simple wool sweater, her eyes milky with cataracts but fixed directly on mine. "The tide is coming in, Nate," she whispered, though we were miles from the actual shoreline. Not the water, the other thing. The thing Carl was scouting for. Before I could grab her arm to lead her to the sled, she turned and walked into the whiteout of a sudden squall. By the time I cleared my goggles, the ridge was empty. No footprints. No Ruth. Just the static screaming in my ear. I returned to my office, that converted storage unit that smelled of diesel, and began tearing through Walt Deer's old files. If the previous officer had broken, he must have left a breadcrumb. Tucked behind the gun safe, I found a leather-bound ledger that wasn't part of the official department inventory. The dates started in October of the previous year. Walt's handwriting began as a clean, professional cursive but devolved into jagged, frantic scratches by December. One entry, dated winter solstice, chilled me more than the Arctic wind. "It's not a sound. It's a door. They think they are walking home, but they are just being invited in. The man with the dry boots isn't a person. He's the doorman." Underneath, Walt had drawn a map of the sea ice with a single X, marked 12 miles due north. It was the exact spot where the crab fisherman had been found dead. But Walt had written a name next to the X that I recognized. Lisa, my ex-wife. There was no way he could have known her name. I headed to Brenda's store, the only place with a generator strong enough to pierce the dark. When I walked in, the bell didn't ring. The store was packed with villagers, maybe 50 of them, standing in total silence. They weren't shopping. They were all facing the north wall, their heads tilted at the same unnatural angle, as if listening to a conversation I couldn't hear. Brenda was behind the counter, her hands hovering over a stack of canned peaches, her eyes wide and glassy. I shouted her name, but no one moved. I grabbed Pete by the shoulder, but his body felt like solid oak, immovable and cold. Then, in unison, they all began to hum. It wasn't a song. It was a low, vibrating frequency that mimicked the heartbeat of the ice. The vibration was so intense that the glass jars on the shelves began to shatter one by one. I backed out of the store, the sound of breaking glass following me into the night, realizing that the population of Canvas was no longer entirely human. I locked myself in my cabin, bracing the door with a heavy timber. The space heater clicked, 40 seconds, but now it was out of sync with the pulse outside. I sat on the floor with my shotgun across my lap, watching the frost crawl up the inside of the door. Then came the knock. It wasn't at the door. It was under the floorboards. 3 slow, heavy thuds. A voice came through the wood, soft, conversational, and terrifyingly familiar. It was Carl. "It's warmer down here, Nate," he said. "The pressure is gone. You don't have to worry about the debt anymore. You don't have to worry about the grocery store in Anchorage." I looked at the floorboards and saw a dark, oily liquid beginning to seep through the cracks. It smelled like ancient salt and rotting kelp. I realized then that the cabin wasn't built on solid ground. It was built on a thin crust of earth over an abyss that had been waiting for a century to open. I decided to call for the state trooper's plane. Weather be damned, I was leaving. I ran to the tribal council building to use the long-range satellite phone. The village was deserted now. The store was empty, the lights flickering. I reached the terminal and dialed the emergency frequency. A voice answered immediately, but it wasn't the police. It was a recording of my own voice from 15 minutes ago, repeating my own thoughts out loud. "I need to get out. I need to get out. The ice is breathing." I dropped the receiver, and it dangled, the recording continuing to play, shifting into a distorted, slowed-down version of my divorce proceedings. I looked out the window toward the landing strip. The blue twilight of noon was starting, but the sky wasn't gray. It was a bruised, pulsing purple. And there, standing on the runway, were the 3 missing villagers, including the woman who left her parka. They were waving at me, beckoning me to the ice. Driven by a madness I couldn't control, I didn't get on my snowmobile. I started walking. I left my heavy coat on the steps of the council building. The cold felt different now. It didn't bite. It felt like a firm, supportive hand pressing against my skin. I walked past the fuel depot, past the edge of the gravel road, and onto the ice shelf. I didn't need a compass. The heartbeat in my chest was pulling me due north. I passed the 6-mile mark, then the 9-mile mark. The ice beneath me began to go translucent. I could see things moving deep below the surface, huge, pale shapes that looked like rib cages the size of skyscrapers. I reached the 12-mile mark, the X on Walt's map. There was no body there. There was a hole in the ice, perfectly circular, about 10 feet wide. The water inside wasn't freezing. It was boiling, but the steam was ice cold.